Clara Whitmore did not cry. Not when Nathaniel's voice cut across the ballroom loud enough for every soul in that gilded room to hear. Not when the music stopped. Not when 200 pairs of eyes turned to watch her humiliation unfold like a stage performance. She simply set down her glass, smoothed the front of her gown, and curtsied, deep, deliberate, and perfectly composed. "As you wish, Mr. Ashford," she said. Then she walked away. If you're new here, subscribe and follow Clara's story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The evening had started the way most summer evenings in Virginia started in the year of our Lord, 1817, with heat that didn't quit. Even after sundown, with fireflies drifting through the open windows of Caldwell Hall, and with the particular kind of laughter that only happens when wealthy people have run out of important things to worry about. Clara Whitmore Ashford had arrived on her husband's arm the way she always did. She had dressed carefully, the pale green silk gown that Nathaniel had never once commented on, the pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, her hair pinned up in the fashion that Margaret, her lady's maid, said suited the shape of her face. She had spent 2 hours preparing for this evening. Not because she expected her husband to notice. She had given up expecting that somewhere around the middle of their second year of marriage. She had done it because she represented the Ashford name tonight, and Clara Whitmore had been raised to do a thing properly or not at all. The hall was full. Half of Albemarle County had turned out, the planters and their wives, the county magistrate and his daughters, the Mercer family from the north end of the county, which meant Caroline Mercer was somewhere in this room. Clara had known that before she arrived. She had felt it the way you feel weather changing a particular pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest that had no name but was always accurate. She had said nothing to Nathaniel about it. Nathaniel was not a man who welcomed what he called worrying without cause. They had been married 2 years and 4 months. In that time, Clara had learned the precise geography of her husband's silences, which ones meant he was thinking, which meant he was angry, which meant he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. She had learned which topics made his jaw tighten. She had learned that he took his coffee black and his opinions uncontested, and that the fastest way to end a conversation with Nathaniel Ashford was to disagree with him in front of other people. She had learned all of this the way women in her position learned most things, by watching, by listening, by paying the kind of careful attention that nobody ever acknowledged or thanked her for. The evening moved the way such evenings moved. Music. Introductions. The Caldwell daughters playing piano in the West Room. Judge Harmon talking too long about land surveys to a group of men who were clearly hungry for supper. Mrs. Patterson asking Clara for what felt like the 4th time this summer whether there was any happy news yet, and Clara giving the same quiet, gracious answer she always gave, the one that said nothing and gave away nothing and satisfied no one, least of all herself. Nathaniel moved through the room separately from her. That had become usual. In the first months of their marriage, he had kept her close, one hand at the small of her back, making introductions, filling her glass before it was empty. That version of Nathaniel felt like something Clara might have dreamed. She could barely call his face to mind now when she tried to remember it, the early version, the almost kind one. Somewhere around the 3rd hour of the evening, Clara found herself standing near the east window with a glass of lemonade. She didn't particularly want listening to 2 women she didn't particularly like discuss the price of muslin in Charlottesville. She smiled at the right moments. She said yes, and oh certainly, and how interesting. And she watched across the room as Nathaniel stood beside Caroline Mercer for the 4th consecutive time that evening. Clara was not a woman given to jealousy. She had examined herself on this point over many months and had concluded that what she felt when she watched Nathaniel with Caroline was not jealousy. It was something more precise than that. It was the recognition of an equation she had been trying to balance for 2 years without success. Nathaniel gave Caroline the easy laugh, the interested question, the full attention of his eyes. What Nathaniel gave Clara was correct behavior. He was never cruel in public. He was never dismissive in front of guests. He simply wasn't there even when he was standing beside her. She had told herself for a very long time that this was enough. That a great many marriages looked like this. That what mattered was the household running well, the accounts in order, the servants treated fairly, the neighbors spoken to kindly. She had told herself that her value was in the doing, in the daily invisible labor of keeping Nathaniel Ashford's world in functioning order, and that this was a purpose worth having, even if no one said so. She had almost convinced herself. Almost. She was still standing at the east window when the music stopped the second time. Not because the song had ended, because Nathaniel had crossed the room. She saw him coming and felt for one strange suspended moment, a flicker of the old feeling, the one from before the marriage, from the brief courtship when he had looked at her as though she were worth looking at. His stride was purposeful. His jaw was set. She recognized that particular set of jaw and felt the flicker extinguish. He stopped in front of her. The women discussing muslin fell silent. Nearby conversations dimmed. People have an instinct for the moment before a thing breaks, the air changes, and people turn toward it, without knowing exactly why. Clara. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. The room had already gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when something important is happening that nobody wants to miss. Nathaniel, she said, calm, even. She held her lemonade glass with both hands and looked at him with the expression Margaret sometimes called her courthouse face, composed, unreadable, giving nothing away. I need to say something, he said, in front of these people, because I believe these things ought to be said plainly without pretense, so there is no confusion later. Something cold moved through her. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. The way you recognize a road you've traveled in a dream. You may say whatever you need to say, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She thought, and she would think about this later, in the quiet of the room, she would sleep in alone for the last time that night. She thought that there was something in his face that might have been hesitation. A single second where the thing might have gone differently. Then it passed. I no longer want you as my wife, Nathaniel Ashford said. Clearly, loudly enough. In front of half of Albemarle County, and the fireflies drifting through the windows, and Judge Harmon with his opinions about land surveys, and Mrs. Patterson, who had asked 4 times about happy news. This marriage has not been what either of us needed. It would be better for both of us to end it. The room did not make a sound. Clara heard her own heartbeat. She heard the distant fiddle player in the far room, who hadn't gotten word yet that the music was supposed to stop. She heard very clearly the sound of a glass being set down somewhere to her left. Careful, deliberate, as though whoever held it had needed to free their hands for whatever came next. She looked at her husband. She looked at him for a long time. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of Caroline Mercer, somewhere behind Nathaniel's left shoulder, and she was aware of the expression on Caroline's face, without needing to look directly at it. She was aware of Mrs. Patterson's mouth, which had fallen open slightly. She was aware of the 2 women who had been discussing muslin, who were no longer discussing muslin. She thought about 2 years and 4 months. She thought about the household accounts she had balanced every quarter, about the servants she had hired and trained and treated decently, because Nathaniel's previous household had been in chaos when she arrived, and she had quietly put it in order without ever being asked and without ever being thanked. She thought about the meals she had planned and the guests she had received, and the letters she had written on his behalf when he was busy, and the one time she had asked him carefully, gently, whether perhaps he might come home for supper before dark just 2 evenings a week, and he had looked at her as though she had said something in a foreign language he didn't speak. She thought about all the ways she had made herself smaller. All the ways she had moved around his foods, like water moving around stone. All the things she had swallowed down and kept from her face, because she had truly believed that if she were patient enough, and good enough, and useful enough, eventually he would see her. She had been wrong. He did not see her. He had looked at her every day for 2 years and 4 months, and what he had seen was a piece of furniture. An arrangement. A wife-shaped absence in the chair across from him at supper. And standing in Caldwell Hall with the fireflies and the lemonade and every important family in the county watching her. Clara Whitmore. Ashford understood something that settled through her like ice water, and then strangely, like relief. She was done. As you wish, Mr. Ashford, she said. Her voice did not shake. It did not rise. It was the voice of a woman who has made a decision so complete that there is nothing left to negotiate. She curtsied low, deliberate, the full formal curtsy that her mother had made her practice until her knees ached, the one appropriate for taking leave of a person of consequence. She gave it to him without irony and without grief. Just precision. Just the clean, correct thing. Then she set her lemonade glass down on the nearest surface, and she walked away. Not quickly. Not the panicked retreat of a woman humiliated. She walked the way she had been taught to walk in a room full of people who were watching her head level, spine straight, each step deliberate. She passed Mrs. Patterson without looking at her. She passed the Caldwell daughters who had appeared in the doorway at some point and were standing close together with identical expressions of shock. She passed Judge Harmon. She passed 3 people whose names she couldn't have told you if her life depended on it. She reached the main door. A young footman she'd never seen before held it open for her, his face arranged in the carefully neutral expression of household staff who have witnessed something they will be describing in the servants' hall for years. "Thank you," she said to him. Because she thanked servants. She always had. She walked out into the Virginia summer night. The heat hit her first. That heavy, insistent July heat that was still pressing down, even now, well past 9 in the evening. She heard the sound of the hall behind her. The resumed murmur of voices. The particular quality of a room full of people who have just witnessed something they cannot quite believe and are very eager to discuss. She did not stop walking. Her carriage was still being held at the far end of the drive. The driver, a man named Samuel who had been with the Ashford household for 11 years, and who had always been kind to Clara, stood up when he saw her coming alone. "Mrs. Ashford." His voice was careful. He had a good face. Samuel did honest and weather-lined and currently working very hard to show nothing. "I'll need you to take me to the house," she said. "Just me." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't ask where Mr. Ashford was. Either he had enough discretion not to, or he had already heard sound carried oddly on summer nights in Virginia and knew better. She rode back to the Ashford house in silence. The carriage swayed on the rutted road, and through the small window she could see the stars coming out thick above the fields, the way they did on clear July nights, so many of them that the sky looked crowded. She had loved that about Virginia from the beginning. The stars were different here than in Baltimore where she'd grown up. More of them and closer seeming as though the sky pressed down toward the land. She had never told Nathaniel that she loved the stars above his property. She had tried once early in the marriage. He had said something polite that made it clear he hadn't been listening. She thought about that. She thought about the specific quality of not being listened to, how it accumulated over time. Deposit by deposit. The way silt builds up in a slow river until suddenly the channel is changed. She thought about how many times she had begun a sentence with Nathaniel and seen his attention slide sideways before she reached the end of it. She thought about the particular careful silence she had developed, the edited version of herself she had assembled to take up as little of his patience as possible. She thought, "I am 25 years old. She thought, "I am not doing this for another year." When the carriage stopped in front of the house, she went directly to her own room. The room that had been hers alone since the early months of the marriage, when they had arrived at the wordless understanding that they would sleep separately. Margaret was there already, half asleep in the chair by the window, because Margaret had never quite managed to break herself of the habit of waiting up. The old woman was awake and on her feet the moment Clara opened the door. She took one look at Clara's face and asked nothing. She simply moved toward the wardrobe. "Not those," Clara said. "We're packing tonight." Margaret turned. Her expression shifted through several things, quickly concern, understanding, and then a steady, practical resolution that Clara had always loved about her. "How much?" she asked. "What's mine?" Clara said. "Only what's mine." "That ain't much in this house." "I know," Clara said. "It won't take long." They worked in near silence for 2 hours. Clara was systematic about it. She had always been systematic, even about grief, even about the end of things. She took her mother's pearl earrings and the small watercolor of the Chesapeake her father had given her as a wedding gift, and the 3 books from the shelf that had her name inside the cover. She took her personal correspondence and the household ledger that she'd been keeping for 2 years, because it was in a way her own record of work, Not something she planned to use as evidence, simply something that was hers by virtue of having been entirely her creation. She took the green silk gown she'd worn tonight and two others. She did not take the Ashford jewels. She did not take the cashmere shawl Nathaniel had given her in the first month of marriage, back when he had still occasionally given her things. She sat at the small writing desk and wrote a letter. It took her 3 drafts. She had a great deal she could have said, and in a different life, or a different temperament, she might have said all of it. The anger was there, she could feel it beneath everything solid and righteous and entirely justified. The grief was there too, though she was surprised to find it was more for the person she had hoped he might become than for the person he actually was. In the end, she wrote 7 sentences. She left it on the desk, where it would be found in the morning. She did not read it over again. Margaret had organized the trunks with her usual quiet efficiency. 2 of them. That was all it amounted to, 2 years and 4 months of a life. 2 trunks and a letter in 7 sentences. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked. She had made it clear without a word that wherever it was she was coming. Clara had thought about this on the carriage ride home. She had an aunt, her mother's sister Frances Whitmore, now Frances Beaumont, who lived in a small house in the western part of the county. A woman who had been widowed young and had built herself a life of remarkable self-sufficiency out of the remains. Aunt Frances had come to Clara's wedding and had said very quietly at the reception, "If you ever need a place, the door is open." Clara had not known what to do with that at the time. She had been a bride. She had been hopeful. "Aunt Frances's," she said. Margaret nodded once, as though she had known it would come to this eventually. As though they had both known somewhere beneath the daily business of maintaining the pretense that everything was all right. "I'll get Samuel," she said. The carriage moved through the dark Virginia roads at close to 3 in the morning, the horses steady on a route they didn't know, stars still thick overhead. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was not crying. She had asked herself somewhere around the point where she packed the 3rd book whether she was going to cry, and she had examined the question the way she examined most things honestly, directly, without the comfort of self-deception, and the answer had been no. She was not happy. Let no one misunderstand that. She was not relieved in the simple, uncomplicated way, not free in the triumphant sense that a different kind of story would have you believe. She was sad. She was sad for the marriage that had never become what a marriage ought to be, sad for the 2 people they might have been to each other in a different set of circumstances. Sad for the children that had not come, and perhaps now would not. She was sad in the way you are sad when you finally stop trying to repair something that was broken before you arrived. But underneath the sadness, and this was what surprised her most, there was something solid. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She had done the right thing. Not the easy thing. Not the comfortable thing. Not the thing that would make anyone in that room tonight comfortable or satisfied or able to avoid the awkward conversation when they next saw her. She had done the only thing she could do with her own dignity intact. She had left. The wheels of the carriage turned on the summer road. Somewhere behind her, the Ashford house stood in darkness. All its rooms in order, all its accounts balanced, all its household arrangements running smoothly because of 2 years of work she had done, and that what she suspected began to fall apart within the week. She thought, let it. She pressed her back against the seat and looked out at the dark road ahead and thought about Aunt Frances and her small house and the particular freedom of a door that opened to let her in, rather than a room she had always been on the outside of. She thought about what she would do next. Not in the grand sense, not yet. In the immediate sense. What she would have for breakfast. Whether Aunt Frances kept a garden. Whether there were people in that part of the county who needed things that she was good at providing. Teaching, organizing the careful, reliable work of a mind that didn't quit and hands that didn't idle. She would find out. She was 25 years old. The road was dark, and the stars were thick, and the carriage moved west through the Virginia summer night, carrying Clara Whitmore away from a life that had never quite been hers, and toward something that for the first time in 2 years and 4 months remained entirely undecided. The driver Samuel clicked softly to the horses. The horses moved steady and without complaint through the dark, and behind her in Caldwell Hall. The candles were still burning, and the guests were still talking, and Nathaniel Ashford stood where she had left him, exactly where she had left him, in the middle of a room full of people, who had all suddenly remembered other places to look. For the first time that evening, he was not surrounded by voices. He was standing in the loudest silence of his life, and he had absolutely no idea yet what he had just lost. Nathaniel Ashford did not sleep that night. He told himself he would. He told himself that what had happened at Caldwell Hall was a necessary thing, a clean thing, the kind of decisive action that a man in his position owed himself after 2 years of a marriage that had never quite become what it was supposed to be. He told himself Clara would be at home when he returned, that she would have calmed down, that they would speak in the morning with the particular careful courtesy they had both mastered and arrive at some sensible arrangement. He told himself all of this on the carriage ride home. He walked into a dark house. Not unusual, he reasoned. Late hour. Staff retired for the night. He climbed the stairs, passed her door without stopping, went to his own room, and stood at the window, looking out at the fields in the dark. He did not sleep. By 6 in the morning, he had given up trying. He dressed without ringing for his valet, and went downstairs and found Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, already in the corridor outside the kitchen, with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression on her face that he had never seen there before. Mrs. Holt had been in this house for 14 years. She had survived 2 changes of ownership, a fire in the East Wing, and 3 different mistresses of the household. She was not a woman given to visible emotion. She looked shaken. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Where is Mrs. Ashford?" he asked. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Mrs. Ashford is not in the house, sir." He stared at her. "What do you mean she's not in the house?" "She left last night, sir. She and Margaret. Samuel drove them." Another pause. "She left a letter. It's on the desk in her sitting room." He went upstairs. He went directly to her sitting room, a room he had not entered in. He realized with a sudden strange discomfort, several months, and found the letter on the small writing desk by the window, folded once sealed with plain wax. His name written on the front in her handwriting. Her handwriting, which was the most legible he had ever encountered, even-spaced and unhurried, even under what must have been considerable distress. He broke the seal. He read, "Nathaniel, you said you no longer wanted me as your wife. I have accepted your decision. I have taken only what belongs to me and left everything else in order. The household accounts are current through the end of the month. Mrs. Holt knows the arrangements for the August provisioning. There is nothing left undone. I wish you a good life. I hold no anger toward you. I only ask that you allow me to proceed with mine. Clara Whitmore." 7 sentences. He counted them. She had signed it with her maiden name. He stood there with the letter in his hand for a long time, long enough that Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway, tentative, uncertain whether to speak. "Where did Samuel take her?" he asked. "He didn't say, sir." A careful pause. "I don't believe he felt it was his place to say." Nathaniel set the letter back on the desk. He did not fold it. He was not sure his hands were cooperating with that level of precision. "The household accounts," he said. She said they were current. "Yes, sir. I checked this morning. Everything is exactly as she said. I thought about that." He thought about Clara, somewhere in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, making sure the household accounts were in order before she left, making sure nothing was undone, making sure that even in the act of leaving, she had not left him any practical inconvenience. He thought, what kind of woman does that? I didn't have an answer. He went downstairs and drank 3 cups of coffee and ate nothing, and told himself firmly that by the end of the week she would have reconsidered. She did not reconsider. Day 1 passed. He found himself pausing twice in the hallway outside her sitting room before he remembered she wasn't in it. He found himself at supper with a meal that was well cooked and properly presented, and somehow not quite right in some quality he couldn't name, and it took him until he was halfway through it to realize that for 2 years Clara had been quietly supervising the kitchen, and he had never once noticed until she wasn't there to do it. Day 2. He went to his study and found that he couldn't locate the correspondence file for the Hargrove land lease, which he needed before his meeting on Thursday with the county assessor. He looked for 20 minutes before going to Mrs. Holt in some irritation and asking where it was kept. Mrs. Holt said with exquisite neutrality that Mrs. Ashford had always maintained the correspondence files and that she herself was not entirely certain of the system, but she would try to find it. She found it, eventually. It had been exactly where logic said it should be, in a system so orderly it was almost architectural. Clara's doing every file dated and cross-referenced in that unhurried handwriting of hers. He stood with this Hargrove file in his hand and thought about the system, about what it had taken to build it, about the fact that he had lived in the middle of it for 2 years and never once asked how it worked or who had made it work. Day 3 was when the rumors started. He heard it first from Thomas Elliot, who came by ostensibly to discuss a fencing dispute on their shared property line and managed with the peculiar indirectness of a man who very much wants to deliver bad news but doesn't want to be seen as having enjoyed delivering it, to mention that there was talk in the county. Quite a bit of talk. What kind of talk? Nathaniel said, though he already knew. About the Caldwell Hall business. Elliot looked at his hat brim. People are saying quite a few things. Such as you handled the matter poorly. Elliot put the hat back on his head and looked at him directly because Thomas Elliot was the kind of man who delivered his honest opinion and then had the courage to watch you receive it. Such as Mrs. Ashford is a woman of considerable good character who didn't deserve a public dressing down in front of everyone who matters in this county. Such as the question of why exactly you did it that way when you could have done it privately is a question a good many people have thoughts about. I don't particularly concern myself with what people think, Nathaniel said. Elliot looked at him steadily. I know you don't. I've always thought that was more of a flaw than a quality if you want my honest assessment, which you don't, but there you are. He stood. The fencing dispute. Let me know when you want to sort it out. He left. Nathaniel poured himself a whiskey at 11 in the morning, which was something he did not do, and sat with it untouched on the desk beside the Hargrove file, and thought about the particular quality of Thomas Elliot's expression when he'd said, Mrs. Ashford is a woman of considerable good character. It had not been the expression of a man passing along second-hand opinion. It had been the expression of a man stating a fact he believed personally and completely. Day 4 brought Margaret's absence into sharp relief. He had not thought about Margaret, had barely registered her as a distinct person rather than a piece of household furniture. And this now struck him as a damning fact about himself. But her absence turned out to have effects that spread through the household the way a removed stone changes the shape of a wall. Margaret had apparently been doing 17 things that Nathaniel had never known were being done. The upstairs laundry arrangement. The communication between the house and the 2 housemaids they borrowed for heavy cleaning days. The management of the linen cupboard, which Mrs. Holt now told him with barely contained distress, was an entire system unto itself that she had never been briefed on because Clara and Margaret had always handled it together. Can't someone else handle it? He said. I'm sure someone can, sir, Mrs. Holt said in the tone of a woman who has decided to match his obtuseness with her own. Once we work out what the system is. By day 5, Nathaniel was beginning to understand with the slow and deeply unwelcome clarity of a man watching a building he has damaged start to show its cracks that his household did not run itself. It had never run itself. It had run because a woman with a systematic mind and an apparently inexhaustible capacity for unacknowledged work had run it every single day without complaint and without credit. And now that she was gone, the machinery was beginning piece by piece to show him exactly where she had been standing. He called for his horse. He needed to think, and he thought better moving. He rode out toward the north fields, the same ride he took when he needed to clear his head, and he let the horse set its own pace, and he thought about the letter. About those 7 sentences. About the particular phrase she had used, I have taken only what belongs to me. I thought about what she had taken. 3 books Margaret had told Mrs. Holt, who had told him. Some personal correspondence. 2 traveling trunks. Her mother's earrings. She had left the cashmere shawl he'd given her in the first month of marriage hanging on the hook behind her wardrobe door. She had left everything he'd given her. She'd taken only what was already hers. The horse moved, and the summer fields went by on either side, and Nathaniel Ashford thought about the wardrobe hook and felt something uncomfortable move through him that he refused for the time being to name. He was a week into the silence when Caroline Mercer paid a call. I was in no state for it. He knew he was in no state for it when Mrs. Holt announced her, and he knew it with more certainty when Caroline came into the parlor with the particular expression she wore when she believed she had an advantage. Bright, slightly too warm, the careful animation of a woman performing her best version of sympathetic concern. "Nathaniel," she said, "I came as soon as I reasonably could. This whole business has been such a distressing—" "Sit down, Caroline," he said. She sat. He did not. He stood by the window because he didn't trust himself to perform the social ease that sitting implied. "I'm sure you've been hearing things," she said. "People do talk, and not all of it is." "What did you tell me about Clara?" he said. "Back in May. What exactly did you tell me?" A pause. Something moved behind her eyes. "I told you what I heard," she said carefully. "I told you what people were saying. About her and James Whitmore." "Well, yes. Her cousin Caroline." Silence. "Her cousin," he said again, "who she met once in Charlottesville to sign documents regarding her father's estate. Which I would have known if I had done the simple courtesy of asking her about it, rather than choosing to believe the version of events that a woman who has wanted to marry me for 4 years handed me without a single piece of evidence." He watched her face. He watched the calculations moving behind it. "How long have you known James Whitmore was her cousin?" How long?" Her chin came up. She had nerve, he'd give her that. "I heard differently," she said. "I heard that their relationship was not—" "From whom?" "From people who—" She stopped. Tried again. "There was talk." "There was talk," he repeated. "And you brought me that talk. And I let it change 2 years' worth of reasonable experience of a woman who had never given me a single genuine reason for doubt." He let that sit in the air between them. "Why, Nathaniel, I was only concerned—" "No," he said quietly. "You weren't. Let's not do that." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched the performance fall away, the warm sympathy and the concerned friend expression, and what was underneath it was something starker and more honest. Something almost like relief at being seen clearly, because pretending is its own kind of exhaustion. "I thought," she said finally, "that you weren't happy." "I wasn't." "And that the marriage was not what it should have been." "Yes, that's true." He looked at her steadily. "But those are facts I could have arrived at without your help, Caroline. And what I did with those facts—" He stopped. He thought about Caldwell Hall, about Clara's face, about the curtsy that had been, he now understood, not submission, but its exact opposite. "What I did was wrong. And it was wrong because I let someone hand me a reason to do a thing I didn't have the decency to examine honestly." Caroline stood. Her posture had changed. Something had gone out of it, some aspirational quality, some reaching forward. She looked for the first time since he'd known her tired. "For what it's worth," she said, "I did think you'd be better off." "I don't doubt it," he said. "I also don't forgive it. And I'd ask you not to call here again for some time." She left without another word. He stood in the empty parlor for a long time after the sound of her carriage faded. He had said what he said to Caroline with the clarity of a man who has worked something out. But working something out in the privacy of your own reasoning is entirely different from knowing what to do with it. He had told Thomas he didn't concern himself with what people thought. He had told himself for an entire week that Clara would reconsider. Neither of these things was true anymore. What was true was this. He had stood in a room full of people and publicly ended his marriage to a woman who had done nothing wrong. He had done it partly because of a lie he had wanted to believe, and partly. And this was the harder part, the part that sat in the chest like a stone. Partly because he had wanted a reason. Not for any clear motive he could defend. But because he had been uncomfortable in the marriage and had not known how to say so, and had not known that saying so was something he owed her. And so when someone handed him a ready-made reason that put all the fault outside himself, he had taken it, He had taken it and used it in a room full of the most important people in the county. He had taken it and aimed it at a woman who had packed her trunks at midnight and made sure the household accounts were current before she left. He sat down. It was the first time in 8 days that he had sat down without a purpose, not to read correspondence, not to look at the Hargrove file, not to drink coffee, and tell himself things would work out. He sat down because his legs were willing to hold him up and his pride was not. He sat with his face in his hands and thought about the cashmere shawl hanging on the hook behind the wardrobe door. He had not touched it. He'd gone into her room twice since she left, once looking for a household document he'd thought might be there once for a reason he couldn't now name, and both times he had seen it there, and both times he had looked away from it quickly, the way you look away from something that might, if you let yourself see it fully, be more than you can account for in that moment. I thought about 2 years of mornings where she had been at the breakfast table when he came down, and he had barely registered her presence. 2 years of suppers where she had directed conversation with the quiet skill of someone who has been made to understand that the conversation was never really about her. 2 years of her moving through his house with that unhurried competence, fixing things before they broke, smoothing things before they roughed, building around him. An entire architecture of functioning comfort that he had mistaken for the house simply running well. Houses didn't run well. People made them run well. One person in this case, and he hadn't even known her name for it. He thought about what Thomas Eliot had said. A woman of considerable good character. Eliot had said it the way you say a thing that's been true for a long time, and that you're slightly surprised isn't obvious to the person you're saying it to. Nathaniel Ashford was in some fundamental ways a proud man. He had always known this about himself and had categorized it as a quality, certainty, decisiveness, the willingness to hold his position without apology. He was looking at it differently now. He was looking at it in the light of what he had done with it and what it had cost, and it looked considerably less like a quality. It looked like a wall he had built that had kept everything out, including possibly the only person who had ever genuinely tried to come in. He got up. He went to her room. He stood in front of the wardrobe and he looked at the cashmere shawl on its hook until he could look at it without looking away. Then he went to find Mrs. Holt. "Where did Samuel take her?" he asked again. Different tone than 8 days ago. Something had gone out of it, the presumption that the answer would simply appear because he wanted it. Mrs. Holt looked at him. She was a woman with very good instincts about people, honed by 14 years in service to 2 difficult households. And she read something in his face now that made her consider her answer more carefully than she had the first time. "I can't say with certainty, sir," she said slowly. "But Mrs. Ashford mentioned her aunt once or twice, when she was making arrangements for the October visit that didn't happen. Her mother's sister, a Mrs. Beaumont." "Where does Mrs. Beaumont live?" "Western part of the county, I believe, near Crozet." He knew the road to Crozet. I went to his study, and he sat at his desk, and he did not write out immediately, because he was self-aware enough to know that writing out immediately was the wrong move. It was the move of a man who wanted to feel like he was doing something, and what this situation required was not motion, but correctness. Clara had not left in haste. She had planned. She had packed only what was hers, addressed her letter with her maiden name, left the accounts current. She had been clear. I was not going to undo that clarity with a panicked ride to a house in Crozet. He was going to think about what he owed her and what he was going to say, and whether when he said it, he was capable of saying it without it being in some way still about him. That last question was the hard one. He pulled out paper. He started to write. He stopped. He started again. He crossed out 3 lines and crumpled the page and started fresh, and he did this 4 times before he produced something that he read back and found at least minimally honest, not eloquent, not the kind of thing that would undo what had been done, but honest. An accounting, an acknowledgement. He sealed it. He addressed it to Clara Whitmore because she had signed her letter that way, and he understood now that he needed to meet her on the ground she had chosen. He handed it to the postwriter the next morning. He did not know if she would read it. He did not know if it would matter. What he did know, and this had arrived in him, not like a revelation, but like the slow recognition of something that had been true for a while, was that the house was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. People moved through it. Mrs. Holt gave her instructions. The kitchen produced meals. The horses were fed, and the fields were tended, and the Hargrove file sat in its proper cross-referenced place, and the machinery of the Ashford estate continued to turn. But something was gone from it. Something that he had no name for, that he had never been asked to value, because it had simply been there constant and undemanding. Like warmth from a fire, you stopped noticing because the room was always warm. He was noticing now. He was noticing because the room was cold and getting colder, and he had nobody to blame for that, but the man who had stood in Caldwell Hall and chosen in front of everyone who mattered to put out the fire himself. Outside Crozet, in a small house that sat at the edge of a working property, with a vegetable garden visible from the main road and an elderly apple tree in the front yard. Clara Whitmore was sitting at a different desk, reading a different letter. Her Aunt Frances had handed it to her without comment. Frances Beaumont was a woman who had learned in the decades since her husband died that comment was rarely the thing that was needed. She had made tea. She had set it near Clara's elbow. She had gone back to her own chair by the other window and resumed the mending she had been doing, which was the most tactful thing a person could have done in that moment. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down. "Well," Aunt Frances said without looking up from her mending. "He wrote a letter," Clara said. "I see that." He apologized. Frances's needle moved steadily through the fabric. For which part? Clara considered this. It was a precise question, and her aunt was a precise woman. For the way he treated me at Caldwell Hall, for believing something he should have questioned, for... She stopped. She picked up the letter and read one line again. "I have understood this past week that I am responsible for considerably more than what happened that evening, and that what happened that evening was itself the result of habits of thought and behavior I should have examined long before now." She set it down again. "He seems to understand," she said carefully, "that there was more wrong than just the one night. Does he?" "He does." Frances looked up. Her face was weathered and deeply observant, a face that had survived its own version of this story, and come out the other side with something harder and quieter and more useful than what had gone in. "What do you plan to do about it?" she asked. Clara looked out the window at the apple tree in the yard. A robin was doing something important in its upper branches, very busy and very committed to whatever it was. "Nothing yet," she said. "I plan to do nothing yet." Frances nodded, as though this were the correct answer. Then she went back to her mending, and the room held the particular peace of two women who understand each other well enough not to fill silences unnecessarily. Clara folded the letter. She put it in the small box where she kept her personal correspondence. Then she went to help with the afternoon meal, because there was work to do, and she had always been better at doing work than sitting with uncertainty, and because the people in this small house, Aunt Frances and the two farmhands who came in for the midday meal, and the elderly man who lived in the cottage at the property edge, and who had told Clara on her second day here that she had a sensible way of listening, needed things she was good at providing. She had been here 9 days. In 9 days, she had already made herself useful in 8 ways she hadn't planned. She had reorganized the still room, which had been in considerable disorder. She had written 3 letters for Aunt Frances, who had functional literacy but preferred not to write in formal situations. She had sat with the elderly man from the cottage whose name was Amos for 2 evenings, and listened to him talk about his life before the war. And she had learned more in those 2 evenings than she had in a year of what passed for conversation in the Ashford social circle. She was also teaching, though she hadn't meant to. The farmhand's daughter, a girl of about 12 named Polly, serious-faced and quick-eyed, and apparently starving for exactly the kind of attention that a literate adult with time to spare could provide, had appeared at her door on the 3rd morning with a book she couldn't read, and a look of such carefully managed hopefulness that Clara had simply moved aside and said, "Come in, sit down. Let's start at the beginning." Polly was currently working through her letters with the focus of a person who understands that the thing being offered is worth taking seriously. Clara was remembering daily, and with increasing force, that she was good at this. Good at teaching, good at organizing, good at the kind of patient, careful attention that makes people feel seen. She had been doing it inside the Ashford house for 2 years, and had felt increasingly like water being poured into sand, all the effort, nothing remaining. Out here, something remained. Nathaniel's letter sat in its box. She did not look at it again that night. But she did not stop thinking about it either, about those carefully chosen sentences, the lines he had crossed out before arriving at the ones he sent, which she could somehow sense in the deliberateness of the final version. She thought about the man she had married. Not the cold one from the last 18 months. The one from the beginning, from the brief courtship, who had asked her opinion of Chaucer at a dinner party and actually waited to hear the answer. She thought about whether those two men were the same man. She thought, I do not know yet. And that, for now, was the most honest thing she had. The moon came up over the western fields. Somewhere in the apple tree, the robins settled into silence. And in the Ashford house 12 miles east, Nathaniel sat at his desk with a second sheet of paper in front of him that he didn't yet know how to fill. The second letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was from him before she opened it, the way you know a thing when your body has already decided what it thinks, and your mind is still pretending to be neutral. She was in the kitchen with Aunt Frances cutting dried herbs for the afternoon preserving. When the post rider came, and Frances brought the letter in and set it on the table beside her without a word, and went back to the preserving jar she'd been sealing. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her knife and kept cutting. She read it after supper. It was longer than the first one. More careful in some ways, less polished in others, which meant he had written it without stopping to arrange himself quite so much. He had made inquiries, he said, about James Whitmore. He had gone to some trouble to confirm what he had already come to suspect, that James was her cousin, that their meeting in Charlottesville had been entirely a matter of her father's estate, that there had never been a single fact behind the story Caroline Mercer had put into circulation. He had spoken to 2 people who had been present at that Charlottesville meeting. He had done this, he said, not to prove anything to her, but because he owed it to himself to know the full shape of his own error. That line stopped her. He owed it to himself to know the full shape of his own error. She read it again. She was looking for the place where it became about her, where the accounting of his mistake turned, as these accountings often did, into an argument for why she should respond a particular way. She read it 3 times and didn't find it. What she found instead was a man doing the uncomfortable arithmetic of his own choices, without adding a column at the bottom that demanded she pay the sum. She put the letter in the box with the first one. She sat with her hands in her lap for a while and thought. She thought about Caroline Mercer. She had suspected Caroline for some time, not with certainty, but with the quiet, steady instinct of a woman who has been in a room with a person who wants her gone, and has learned to recognize that particular quality of warmth that isn't warmth. She had said nothing to Nathaniel. She had thought about saying something. She had decided each time that saying something would look like jealousy, and would be received as jealousy, and would do more damage than whatever Caroline was doing quietly in the background. She had been wrong about that calculation. Not wrong to believe that Nathaniel would receive it as jealousy, he would have. Wrong to think that silence was safer. Silence had let the thing grow in the dark until it had become the shape of their entire marriage. That was not all Nathaniel's fault. She held that thought. It was not comfortable. It would have been more comfortable to set it aside and maintain the cleaner version. Wronged woman, careless man, simple moral. But Clara Whitmore had never been able to maintain a version of events she knew to be incomplete, even when the incomplete version was kinder to herself. She had been afraid. Not of Caroline specifically. Of what speaking would cost her in a marriage where she already felt she was operating on insufficient ground. She had kept her silence the way you keep a last coin when you're not sure where the next one is coming from. The cost of that silence had been the same as the cost of spending the coin, only slower, and she hadn't seen it coming. This was what she was thinking about when Polly appeared in the doorway with her primer and her steady, serious face. "Is it a bad time, ma'am?" Polly asked. Clara looked at her and felt something in her chest release, not all at once, just the single specific tension of someone who has been too long inside her own head. "No," she said. "Come in." "Where did we get to?" "The letter F," Polly said with the precision of someone who has been paying very close attention. "Which I can already do, but I wanted to show you." "Show me then." The lesson lasted an hour and a half. By the end of it, Clara had almost, not entirely, but almost stopped thinking about the letter in the box. Almost. What she had not anticipated in the days after Nathaniel's second letter was that the county would find its way to her door before she found her way back to any decision about him. It started with Mrs. Caldwell, Eleanor Caldwell, whose hall it had been, whose summer party had been the stage for the whole public disaster, came to call on a Thursday morning, and she did not come with the barely concealed avidity of a woman pursuing gossip. She came with Francis's favorite tea and a basket of early peaches, and an expression of genuine, uncomplicated discomfort, the kind that belongs to a person who knows they owe something and has come to pay it. "I didn't stop it," Eleanor said when they were sitting with the tea and Aunt Frances had found somewhere else to be, with the particular tact she deployed like a tool. "I saw what he was doing. I saw it coming, I think, from the moment he crossed the room, and I didn't say a word. I told myself it wasn't my place." "It wasn't your place," Clara said, because this was true. "It wasn't. But I've thought about it a good deal since, and I believe there are moments when what's not your place is less important than what's right." Eleanor looked at her directly. "I'm sorry, Clara. You conducted yourself with more grace than anyone in that room deserved." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she poured more tea. "Thank you for coming to say so. I also came," Eleanor said, and her voice shifted slightly, became more deliberate, more careful. "Because I heard something this week that I thought you should know." Clara set down the teapot. "What did you hear?" "I heard that Caroline Mercer has been telling people very selectively, mind you, in the way she does things, that what happened at the ball was as much your doing as his. That there were reasons behind his decision, that he was too much of a gentleman to state publicly." The room held very still. "Is that so?" Clara said. "It is. She's being careful about it. She doesn't say it directly. She says it in the way of someone expressing concern. Of course, there's always more to these situations, that sort of thing. But she's saying it to the right people, or the wrong people depending on how you look at it." Eleanor watched her face. "I thought you deserved to know." Clara thought about that for the length of time it took her to breathe twice. She thought about the long, patient silence she had kept for 2 years. She thought about the careful, shrinking version of herself she had assembled in that marriage to avoid exactly this, to avoid giving anyone a reason to question her conduct or her character. She had been so quiet, so correct, so relentlessly beyond reproach, and it hadn't mattered. Caroline Mercer was in the county's parlors, telling a story about reasons, and the county was listening because the county always listened. And Clara's 2 years of good conduct were no louder than a whisper next to the particular carrying quality of strategic doubt. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was even. "I'm grateful you told me." After Eleanor left, Clara sat for a while with her hands flat on the table and her jaw set. Frances came back in. She looked at Clara's face and went directly to the kitchen shelf and came back with something that was not tea. She set it on the table. "What are you thinking?" Frances said. "I'm thinking," Clara said slowly, "that I have been quiet for a very long time. And I'm thinking that I may have confused being quiet with being safe." Frances looked at her steadily. "Were they the same thing?" "No," Clara said. "It turns out they weren't." Frances sat down across from her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother was quiet too, you know. She thought it protected her. It protected her from certain things. It didn't protect her from others." Clara looked at her. Frances rarely talked about Clara's mother. Her sister, the way you rarely talk about a wound that's mostly healed, but still in certain weather makes itself felt. "What did it not protect her from?" Clara asked. "Being misread," Frances said simply. "People see a quiet woman, and they write their own story on her. They fill the silence with whatever suits them." She looked at Clara with eyes that were kind and absolutely honest. "The question isn't whether you defend yourself. The question is how." Clara thought about that for a long time after Frances went to bed. She thought about how. She wrote a letter that night, not to Nathaniel. To Judge Harmon, who had been at Caldwell Hall, who had looked at her with what she had read in the moment as pity, but which she was now re-examining and thinking might have been something closer to respect, and who had been her father's acquaintance before he was anything else. She wrote carefully. She stated facts. She said nothing that was not the precise truth. She asked for nothing except that he be willing at his convenience to speak with her about a matter of character she believed needed addressing. She sealed it. She addressed it in her mother's handwriting. No, her own handwriting, which looked like her mother's, because her mother had taught her, which was not the same thing. She gave it to the postwriter in the morning. 3 days passed. Then everything happened at once. The first thing was Nathaniel arriving. She didn't know he was coming. She was in the front room helping Polly with her letters when she heard the horse on the road, and then Francis's voice at the door, and then a different voice that her body recognized before her mind caught up the particular baritone of a man who'd had a good education and couldn't quite hide it, even when he was trying to sound simple. She stayed where she was. Polly looked up. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "Keep going," Clara said. "Show me the letter G." Polly showed her the letter G with commendable focus, given that there were clearly interesting things happening in the other room. Frances appeared in the doorway. Her expression was exactly what it always was. Neutral, observant, and giving nothing away, except for one small thing at the corner of her eyes that Clara had learned in 3 weeks meant she was being very carefully watched. "There's someone at the door for you," Frances said. "I know," Clara said. She finished the line she was working through with Polly. She asked Polly to practice the next 3 letters on her own, which Polly accepted with the gravity of someone given a serious assignment. Then she smoothed her dress, and went to the door. He was standing outside it. He had not brought anyone with him. No household staff, no companion, none of the various appurtenances of a man of his position. He was in plain riding clothes, and he had clearly ridden here himself, and he looked, and this startled her, because she had prepared herself for various versions of this encounter, but not quite this one. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping particularly well. "Clara," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. The formality was deliberate. She watched him hear it and hold it without flinching. "I'd like to speak with you," he said, "if you're willing." "You rode 12 miles, she said. "I can give you a few minutes." She stepped out, rather than inviting him in. This was also deliberate. This was her door, her aunt's house, her territory, and she was not going to have this conversation in someone else's parlor by default. They walked to the edge of the yard, the apple tree between them and the house, the summer afternoon heavy and still around them. "I've been speaking to people," he said. He said it without preamble, which she noted. He had apparently decided that whatever this conversation was, it was not going to be social. "About that evening in Charlottesville. About James Whitmore. About exactly what was said to me and when and by whom. I know, you wrote to me about it. I wrote to you about what I'd confirmed. I didn't write to you about what I've understood since." He looked at her directly. He was doing that now, she noticed, looking at her directly the way he hadn't for most of their marriage. It was almost uncomfortable. Almost. "I've understood that I didn't need Caroline Mercer to hand me a reason. I was looking for one. I'd been looking for one for months without knowing that's what I was doing. She provided it, and I took it, and what I did with it was my own choice from start to finish." Clara let that sit in the air for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it was. I know that an apology. I received your letters, Nathaniel, both of them. I understood the apology." He looked at her. "Then what do you understand about what comes next?" "Nothing," she said. "I understand nothing about what comes next. That's honest." He was quiet for a moment. A bird moved in the apple tree above them, the robin, she thought, or one very like it. "I've heard what Caroline has been saying," he said then. "About reasons. About your conduct." Something shifted in her. Not surprised, she had known Eleanor would not be the only one talking. But the fact that he knew and had come here and had said it first without making her bring it to him, that was something different. "I've written to Judge Harmon," she said. He looked at her carefully. "What did you say to him?" "Facts," she said. "Only facts. My own conduct, my own record, the nature of what actually happened, and why. I don't intend to let stories be told about me that I can correct by simply telling the truth clearly and to the right people." She looked at him. "I should have done it sooner in various forms about various things. I waited because I thought quiet was safe. I was wrong." Clara, I'm not finished, she said. Not sharply, just firmly. She had things to say that she had not said, that she had packaged very carefully into silence for 2 years, and they were coming out now in the plain daylight of this yard, one at a time in proper sentences, because she had decided that quiet was done. I kept things from you, she said. Not lies. I never lied to you. But I kept my observations and my concerns and my very genuine unhappiness to myself, because I had learned very quickly that expressing them made things worse. I kept quiet about Caroline because I thought you'd hear jealousy. I kept quiet about how alone I felt in that house because I thought you'd hear complaint. I made myself smaller month by month, and I told myself it was patience, but it wasn't. It was fear. And that is partly my own fault. I was looking at her as though he was seeing something for the first time. Which he probably was, she thought. She had never stood in front of him like this, just stood solid and clear-eyed and present, and said the actual truth. I am not telling you that to relieve you of responsibility, she said. You had your own considerable share of it. I'm telling you because it's true, and I believe we're both done pretending that simple stories are enough for complicated failures. A long silence. You're right, he said. Quiet. No performance to it. Just a man in a yard in the summer afternoon saying what was true. I know I'm right, she said. And then, because she was also a woman with a sense of proportion, a small part of her almost smiled. He saw it. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the precondition of one. What do you want? He said. Not what you're willing to accept. Not what would be reasonable or expected. What do you actually want? Clara looked at him. It was, she realized, the first time he had ever asked her that question. All the months of the courtship, and all the 2 years and 4 months of the marriage, not once had he asked her what she actually wanted. The asking of it now was its own kind of answer. I want my name to be clear, she said. I want what Caroline Mercer has been saying to be addressed publicly by someone with standing to address it before it becomes the story the county settles on. She held his gaze. I want that done properly. I'll speak to Judge Harmon myself, he said. Before the end of the week. Whatever you wrote to him, I'll follow it with my own account and my own... He stopped. Started again. My own correction of the record. Publicly, if that's what it takes. She studied him. And Caroline. I've already spoken to Caroline, he said. She won't? He stopped again. Whatever he had said to Caroline, he was deciding how much of it to offer here, and she watched him make that decision. She understands that she's done sufficient damage, and that continuing will cost her more than she wants to pay. She won't continue. Clara thought about this. She thought about Eleanor Caldwell, and her peaches, and her genuine discomfort. She thought about Judge Harmon, and the letter she had written him full of careful facts in her even unhurried handwriting. She thought about Polly in the front room, working through the letter G with the seriousness of someone who had decided this was worth getting right. All right, she said. He looked at her carefully. All right means I'll wait to see what you do, she said. Not what you say you'll do, what you do. He nodded. Not the quick nod of a man who has gotten what he came for and is already moving on to the next thing. A slow, deliberate nod. A man settling into something. That's fair, he said. I know it is, she said. He didn't push for more. That surprised her. Or rather, it would have surprised the version of her that had left his house 2 weeks ago. This version was revising her assessment in real time, and the assessment was still incomplete, but it was no longer entirely fixed. He said he would ride out. He asked before he left whether there was anything the household needed, not as a husband, reasserting authority she felt, but as a person uncertain of his standing, looking for a solid thing to do. She said they were well supplied, and thanked him, because she thanked people as a matter of genuine habit and not performance. He rode out. Frances was in the doorway when Clara came back inside. Well, Frances said. He's going to speak to Judge Harmon, Clara said. Is he? He says so. Do you believe him? Clara considered. I believe he means it right now, she said carefully. Whether he follows through is a different thing. I'll know more by the end of the week. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your Aunt Ruth, your father's sister. You remember her. She said something to me once when I was about your age. She said the most useful thing a woman can learn is the difference between a man who's sorry and a man who's changed. She said sorry is cheap because it only costs feelings. Change is expensive because it costs habits. Clara looked at her. Which one do you think he is? Frances tilted her head slightly. I think, she said, that he came here, in plain clothes on his own horse without anyone to see him do it. And I think he said what he said without asking you to make it easier for him. A pause. That's not change, but it might be a man making himself buy the first thing that change costs. Clara thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she helped with the evening meal, and while she walked the property edge in the long summer twilight, and while she sat with Amos in the doorway of his cottage and listened to him talk about the river he'd grown up beside, and while she lay in the narrow bed in her aunt's spare room, looking at the ceiling with the window open and the summer dark coming in, and the sounds of the country quiet all around her. She thought about habits, about what they cost to change and what they cost not to change, about whether a man who had spent 34 years building a particular set of habits could genuinely dismantle them, or whether he would eventually revert, and whether she would be standing in the middle of that reversion if it came. She thought about herself, about the habits she was examining in her own nature, the silence, the smallness, the careful shrinking that she had done in the name of patience. She was dismantling those too. She had already started. The letter to Judge Harmon was part of it. The conversation this afternoon was part of it. The way she had stood in her aunt's yard and said the actual truth in actual sentences, without packaging it first, to make it easier to receive. She was different out here than she had been in that house. She wasn't sure what to do with that yet. What she knew was this: her name needed to be clear. Her record needed to be visible. Whatever came next with Nathaniel, or without him, she needed to be standing on solid ground, and that ground needed to be built from truth, not silence. She would know more by the end of the week. She closed her eyes on the thought and let the summer dark do its work. 2 miles across the county, at almost that same hour, a conversation was happening in Judge Harmon's study that Clara did not know about yet. Nathaniel Ashford had not waited for the end of the week. He had ridden directly from Crozet to the judge's house, still in his plain riding clothes, and presented himself at the door and asked if the man had an hour. And Judge Harmon, who had indeed received Clara's letter 2 days prior, and had been sitting with it in his particular thoughtful way ever since, had said yes, come in. They were 2 hours in when the judge said the thing that Nathaniel would later tell Clara about, the thing that put a shape around what he'd been circling for 2 weeks. He said, "You know what struck me about her letter?" "What?" Nathaniel said. "She didn't ask me to do anything against you," the judge said. "She didn't ask me to think ill of you or to make any judgment about your character or to take any action on her behalf that involved you at all. She only asked me to be willing to know her own record and her own conduct." He looked at Nathaniel steadily. "She separated herself from you so cleanly, it was almost a legal argument. She wasn't asking to be seen in relation to you. She was asking to be seen." Nathaniel was quiet. Now that Harmon said, "is a woman who knows what she's worth." And I'll be honest with you, Nathaniel, it made me think considerably harder about a man who had her in his house for 2 years and apparently looked straight at her and didn't see it. Nathaniel said nothing. He thought it was probably best in this moment not to say anything at all. The judge poured them both more of the whiskey he kept for important conversations. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. "I came here tonight, didn't I?" Nathaniel said. "You came here tonight," Harmon agreed. "That's a beginning. I'll give you that." A pause. "The question is, what comes after the beginning?" Nathaniel looked at the glass in his hand. He thought about what Clara had said in the yard. "Not what you say you'll do. What you do." "I reckon I'll have to figure that out," he said. "And I don't think she's going to make it easier for me to figure it out than it actually is." "No," Harmon said with what might have been the smallest trace of approval. "I don't imagine she will." Outside, the Virginia summer held its heat even now, well past dark, and the roads between Crozet and the county seat lay quiet under the same thick stars that Clara could see from her window, and both of them separately, 12 miles apart, were sitting with the same understanding, settling into them like a stone, finding its place at the bottom of still water. Something had changed. It had not changed enough yet, but it had changed. Judge Harmon called the meeting on a Friday. He did it the way he did everything, without drama, without announcement, with the particular quiet authority of a man who has presided over enough human difficulty to know that the most effective way to handle a thing is to handle it plainly and in front of the right people. He sent notes to 6 households. He did not explain the purpose in the notes. He simply said he had a matter of county record he wished to address, and that he expected the courtesy of their attendance. 6 households meant 12 people. 12 people meant by the end of that same afternoon that half the county knew something was happening at the judge's house on Friday and was trying to determine what. Clara received her note on Wednesday. She read it twice, then folded it with the clean precision that was native to her and set it beside the box where she kept Nathaniel's letters. Frances watched her from across the room. "Well," she said. "Friday," Clara said. Frances nodded. She asked no further questions. She understood, as she usually did, that Clara had already made the relevant calculations and did not need them talked through. What Clara had calculated was this: Harmon had moved faster than she expected, which meant Nathaniel had moved faster than she expected, which meant the thing she had said in the yard, "Not what you say, you'll do what you do," had landed somewhere. It was not merely heard, but felt. That was information. She was adding it to everything else she knew and everything she was still learning, and she was not yet drawing a conclusion from it, but she was no longer refusing to look at it directly. She wrote back to the judge and said she would attend. She spent Thursday being more useful than usual, which was her nature under pressure. She went harder at the work in front of her when she was turning something over inside, as though the doing of concrete things kept the uncertainty from taking up too much space. She sat with Polly for 2 hours. She reorganized the section of the stillroom she hadn't gotten to yet. She sat with Amos in the early evening and listened to him and was present for him and let his steady, unhurried way of talking slow something down in her that had been running fast all day. Amos said at one point, in the way he had of arriving at things sideways, "You know, I learned about people who wrong you." "What's that?" Clara said. "That the ones worth keeping are the ones who come back and stand in front of it," he said. "Not the ones who pretend it didn't happen. Not the ones who send somebody else to say the words. The ones who stand right in front of what they did and don't look away from it." Clara looked at him. Has he stood in front of it? Amos was quiet for a moment. He was a man who didn't answer fast if the truth required a moment of honest consideration. "From what you've told me," he said finally, "he's been walking toward it. That ain't the same thing, but it ain't nothing either." She thought about that through the night and into Friday morning. Frances insisted on coming. Not argued, insisted in the quiet, immovable way of a woman who has decided a thing and is simply informing you of it. Clara did not argue. She was glad if she was honest. There are certain rooms you enter better when there is someone beside you who knows the whole story and is on your side without qualification. They arrived at the judge's house just past 10 in the morning. 6 households, 12 people, all finding their seats in his parlor, all trying to read the room before the room announced itself. Clara saw Eleanor Caldwell immediately. Eleanor caught her eye and gave her a small nod, the kind that communicates solidarity without requiring a speech. She saw Thomas Elliot, who tipped his hat to her with an expression that was plain and respectful. She saw 2 women she knew only by name and reputation, both of whom she suspected had been among Caroline Mercer's more attentive audiences. She did not see Nathaniel. Not yet. She did not see Caroline Mercer at all. She and Frances found seats. Frances arranged herself in her chair with the manner of a woman fully prepared to hold her ground for as long as necessary. Clara folded her hands in her lap and breathed steadily and waited. Judge Harmon came in at 10:15. He was a large man with a deliberate way of moving that made every room he entered feel slightly more ordered than it had been before he arrived. He stood at the front of the parlor, looked around at the assembled 12, and began without preamble. "I've asked you here because there is a matter of public record in this county that needs to be corrected," he said. "Those of you who were at Caldwell Hall 3 weeks ago know what I'm referring to. Those of you who were not were told about it within 2 days, so let's not pretend otherwise." A few people shifted. Nobody spoke. When Harmon used that particular tone speaking before he invited, it was not a thing people generally attempted. There has also been, he said, subsequent talk in this county that I find considerably more troubling than the original incident. Talk that implies that Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, bore some responsibility for what occurred. That there were reasons not stated publicly. I want to address that directly. He looked around the room. His gaze was slow and specific. I have reviewed the facts, he said. I have spoken to multiple parties. I am prepared to state for the record, and in front of witnesses, that there is not a single verifiable fact to support any suggestion of impropriety on Mrs. Whitmore's part. Not one. What there is evidence of a story that was constructed and circulated for purposes that had nothing to do with truth. One of the women Clara knew only by reputation made a small sound. Harmon looked at her. She stopped making the sound. Furthermore, he said, I will state for the record that during her time as the mistress of the Ashford household, Mrs. Whitmore conducted herself with a level of competence, integrity, and genuine care for the people in her charge that reflects well on her, and not, I will be direct, on the household that failed to recognize it adequately. That last phrase sat in the room like something with weight. The door opened. Nathaniel came in. He had been there. Clara understood. In retrospect, had been somewhere in the house waiting, because Harmon had arranged it that way, or because he had arranged it himself and Harmon had agreed. Either way, he walked in at the moment Harmon had left the precise opening for him, and he walked in without any of the performance that she might have expected from a man trying to repair his public standing. He walked in like a man doing something difficult and choosing not to make it easier on himself by dressing it up. He looked at Clara first, directly before he looked at anyone else in the room. Then he looked at the judge and said, I'll take it from here if you're willing. Harmon stepped aside. Nathaniel turned to face the room. He did not look comfortable. He looked like a man who had decided that comfort was not the point. What happened at Caldwell Hall 3 weeks ago was wrong, he said. It was wrong in what I said, and wrong in how I chose to say it, and wrong in the reasoning that led me to it. I accepted a story without questioning it. I used that story as a reason to do something publicly that I should never have done publicly or privately. A pause. Mrs. Whitmore did nothing to deserve what I did. The story that was told to me about her was false. I knew within 10 days that it was false. I am stating that now here in front of these people because she deserves to have the record corrected in the same company where it was damaged. The room was absolutely still. Clara was looking at her hands. She made herself look up. She made herself watch him say it because she had spent 2 years not looking directly at things, and she was done with that. He met her eyes and held them. I also want to say, he said, and his voice dropped slightly, not quieter in volume, but quieter in quality. Something going out of it that was for the room, and something remaining that was for her, that the injury I did her goes beyond that one evening, that the evening was the end result of a long series of failures on my part that I am still in the process of understanding. I don't ask for anyone's judgment of that. I state it because it's true, and because I believe the truth has a better chance of being useful than any version of it that's been tidied up. He stopped. Nobody in the room moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Thomas Elliot cleared his throat and said quite plainly, "Well, that took something, Ashford." Nathaniel looked at him. "Reckon it should have happened sooner," he said. There was a shift in the room then. Not a dramatic shift, not applause, not a turning tide. Just the particular adjustment that happens in a group of people when something they'd braced themselves to watch turns out to be more honest than they'd expected, and they have to recalibrate. Eleanor Caldwell looked at Clara. Clara gave her a small nod. Frances beside Clara said nothing at all. But Clara felt her aunt's posture settle just slightly from readiness into something closer to ease. Harmon wrapped the meeting in 10 minutes. He had said what he had to say. Nathaniel had said what he had to say. The record was corrected in the only way a public record can be corrected publicly, plainly, with enough witnesses that the story it replaced would have nowhere useful to go. People filed out. There was the careful, muted quality of people who have witnessed something real and are still absorbing it. Clara stood. Nathaniel crossed the room to her. Not quickly. He didn't hurry it. He gave her the space of his approach so that she could decide what to do with it. She waited until he was 2 feet from her. "That was well done," she said. She meant it. She was not effusive about it, and she was not cold. She meant it exactly as much as she said it, and no more. "It was the minimum of what was owed," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was. I appreciate that you knew that." Frances, who had said nothing through all of it, chose this moment to say that she would wait outside and let the judge know they were done with his parlor. She left with a briskness that fooled nobody. Clara and Nathaniel stood in the emptying room. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "The morning after you left, I went into your room." He said this carefully, as though he'd been deciding whether to say it for some time. "I was looking for a document. That was the reason I told myself. But I think the actual reason was that He stopped. Tried again. "I didn't know what I expected to find. I found the room exactly in order. Every single thing in its place. The bed made. The desk cleared. The wardrobe." He stopped again. "You left the cashmere shawl." Clara held his gaze. "I know I did." "Why?" She considered how to answer. She had asked herself the same question in the week after leaving, and had arrived at an answer that was simple enough to be true and complicated enough to be honest. "Because I didn't want to carry something you had given me out of that house," she said. "At that particular moment. Not out of anger. Just I needed to carry only what was mine. What had been mine before you." She paused. "And I think I also left it because leaving it meant acknowledging that something had happened between us that was worth leaving a mark about. If I'd taken it, it would have been easy to pretend there was nothing there. The leaving of it felt truer." He looked at her for a long time. "I haven't moved it," he said. "It's still on the hook." "I know you probably haven't had reason to," she said. "I've had reason to," he said. "I've been in that room. I didn't move it." He let her hear the weight of that. "I'm not entirely certain why, but I think it was something like what you just described, a thing that felt truer than moving it." Clara looked at him. She was doing what she had been doing since he arrived at her aunt's house, the careful, honest accounting of a woman who has learned the cost of being inexact with herself. She was looking at the man in front of her and trying to see him with neither the hopefulness of the woman she had been in the early marriage, nor the protective flatness of the woman she'd needed to be to get through the end of it. What she saw was a man who had done considerable damage and was doing considerable work and was not asking her to make that work easier. That was not nothing. "What is it you want, Nathaniel?" she said. She used his given name. She heard it land between them and felt the difference it made. "I want to court you," he said. "Not as the man you married, as someone who—" He stopped himself. Took a breath. Started over. "I know I have no standing to ask for what I want. I know I forfeited standing. So I'm not asking for what I want. I'm asking for the chance to try to earn it back. Slowly. On whatever terms you set." She had thought in the days since his visit to Crozet about what she would say if he asked exactly this. She had prepared herself for it the way she prepared for most things. Not scripting it, but knowing her own mind well enough that when the moment came, she could speak from it directly. She had decided she would not make it easy. Not from cruelty, from honesty. Because easy would not serve either of them. Because she knew now with a clarity that had come from 3 weeks of living differently, that the thing that had gone wrong in their marriage had not gone wrong only on his side, and that whatever came next needed to be built on different ground than what came before. "Here is what I'll agree to," she said. "I'll agree to see you, occasionally, not often, not under the pretense that anything is decided. If you come to me to Aunt Frances's house or wherever I am, and you come the way you've been coming without performance, without expecting a particular outcome, then I'll receive you." She held his gaze. "But I will not return to your house. Not until I am certain, not hopeful, not willing certain, that what I return to is something genuinely different from what I left. And I will make that judgment myself on my own time, without pressure." Howe was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I expected," he said. "And exactly what I should have expected." She almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "It is." "I'll take it," he said, gratefully. She held out her hand. Not the hand of a wife to a husband. The hand of one person to another person who has said something that can be agreed to. He took it. His grip was brief, careful, without presumption. She left with Francis. In the carriage back to Crozet. Francis was quiet for the first several minutes. Clara watched the road and let the quiet be what it was. Then Francis said, "The shawl." "What about it?" Clara said. "You left it," Francis said. "He kept it. Neither of you moved it." A pause. That's a whole conversation neither of you had to have in words. Clara thought about that. She thought about the hook behind the wardrobe door. About the particular way that some things sit in the middle of two people's lives and hold more meaning than the things those people say out loud. "It's still just a shawl," she said. Said Francis, which was not agreement. The road moved under them. The summer heat pressed its familiar weight. What Clara did not tell Francis, what she had not told anyone, and was not ready to name yet even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that when Nathaniel had looked at her in that parlor and said, "I haven't moved it," something had shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories where the moment is large and obvious. It was the small, specific shift of a true thing landing accurately. She pressed her back against the carriage seat and watched the familiar road back to Crozet and told herself there was no hurry, that she had time, that she was 25 years old, and she had learned recently, and at considerable cost, that patience was only a virtue when it was applied to the right things. Applied to silence, it was surrender. Applied to the slow building of a true thing, it might be the only instrument that worked. She would see. She was for the first time in 2 years actually willing to see. Back in the county in the judge's parlor that had now emptied, Harmon poured himself a glass of water and sat down in his chair and thought about what he had just watched happen. He thought about Clara's letter, those careful, precise sentences, the request to be seen independent of anyone else. He thought about Nathaniel's face when he'd said it was the minimum of what was owed. He thought about the two women whose names he knew, and Caroline Mercer's particular talent for useful damage. He thought about what he would write in his own correspondence. In the next week, the quiet, specific redirecting of a narrative that had been circulating unchecked in the county's parlors and now needed to be replaced with the accurate version. How was a man who believed in accurate versions? He had spent 30 years in the law, learning that the distance between a story and the truth was usually not as large as people made it, and that the most effective thing you could do with a false story was not argue against it, but simply replace it with a true one, clearly stated in front of people who would carry it. The true story was this. Clara Whitmore had done nothing wrong. She had conducted herself in the worst possible circumstances with the kind of character that most people aspired to and few demonstrated. She had left a house cleanly and without bitterness, and had built something of value in the 3 weeks since, with the particular competence of someone who knows exactly what they're good at. And a man who had wronged her had stood in a room full of witnesses and said so without being asked, without being compelled, and without using his wealth or his position as a cushion to soften what he was admitting. That was not redemption. Harmon knew better than to call it redemption. Redemption was a long thing built over time, and it wasn't his to name. But it was, he thought, the beginning of a man who might earn one. Outside the August heat sat over Albemarle County without apology. The summer was not done. There were weeks of it still left. Weeks of heat and long light, and the particular quality of Virginia afternoons when time moves differently than it does in other seasons, slower and heavier and somehow more honest, as though the heat has burned away whatever was allowing pretense. Clara Whitmore was on the road back to Crozet. Nathaniel Ashford was on the road back to his house, which was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 3 weeks, but which felt for the first time quiet in a way that had a question in it, rather than simply an absence. He rode without rushing. He had somewhere to be eventually, but today it was not a where. It was a what he was going to do, and how he was going to do it, and what it would mean to do it right rather than quickly. I thought about what she had said. I'll make that judgment myself on my own time without pressure. He had always been a man who moved toward a resolution, who once he had decided a course moved on it without ambiguity. It was a quality he had applied to land and business, and the management of his household, and he now understood to his marriage, to the decision to end it in particular, which he had executed with the precision of a man taking action on a clear objective. She was asking him to be a different kind of man. Not permanently, she was not. He was quite sure asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to be capable of a kind of patience that had no guaranteed outcome. To move toward something without knowing whether it would be there when he arrived. He wasn't sure he knew how. He was fairly sure that learning how was the actual work. He rode the 12 miles back through the August heat, and went to his study, and sat at his desk, and did not write anything. He just sat. He sat with the particular quality of a man who has come to understand that the hardest thing he's ever been asked to do is the thing that most deserves doing. In the still room at Aunt Frances's house, the herbs were drying, and the preserving jars were lined up in their orderly rows, and Polly was in the front room with her primer, working through a page she'd been assigned with the focused determination of a girl who has decided she is going to read, and nothing is going to prevent her. And Clara Whitmore was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made herself in the house that had become in 3 weeks more genuinely hers than anywhere she'd lived in the last 2 years. She sat there, and she thought, and she let the summer afternoon do its slow work around her. She was not decided. But she was no longer afraid of deciding. That was the difference. That was the thing that 3 weeks of living her own life in a house where she was needed for exactly what she was, and nothing required her to be smaller, or quieter, or more carefully arranged. That was what that had given her. She was not afraid of deciding. When she did decide, it would be the truest thing she had ever chosen. He came back on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the judge's meeting. No letter first. No warning. Just the sound of a horse on the road, and then Frances at the door, and then his voice, which Clara heard from the kitchen where she was working with Polly on compound words, and which she heard the way she had heard it the first time, her body knowing it before her mind caught up some deep internal register that had nothing to do with decision. She finished the word she and Polly were working through. She asked Polly to write it 3 times. Then she dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. He was holding something. She registered it before she registered anything else, a small bundle wrapped in cloth held with the particular careful grip of a man who is not used to carrying things that matter and is afraid of doing it wrong. He held it out to her before she'd even gotten the door fully open. "I brought this back," he said. She took it. She knew what it was before she unwrapped it. The weight was right, the particular softness of the cloth beneath the wrapping. She opened it anyway, and there it was, the cashmere shawl folded neatly, the deep red of it still rich and unfaded. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You said you hadn't moved it," she said. "I hadn't," he said. "Until yesterday. I took it off the hook, and I brought it here because it belongs to you, and it has always belonged to you, and I should not have given you things you felt you had to leave behind." He said this without ornament, the way he had been saying things lately, stripped of the performance she'd spent 2 years watching him maintain. "I'm not bringing it back as a gesture. I'm bringing it back because it's yours." Clara held the shawl in her hands. She thought about the morning she had left it, the deliberateness of it, the way leaving it had felt like truth. She thought about the fact that he had come here without warning, without preparation, carrying something he could have sent by messenger, and had chosen not to. "Come in," she said. He came in. Frances appeared, briefly assessed the situation with one look, and found somewhere else to be with a speed and decisiveness that Clara deeply appreciated. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had read his letters, where she had talked to Eleanor Caldwell, where she had worked through what she wanted and what she was willing to accept. He sat across from her and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary, which was itself new. The Nathaniel she had been married to had used social confidence, the way some people use weather to fill space to keep things moving, to prevent the kind of quiet where something real might have to be said. This man sat with the quiet. "How long have you been coming?" she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean? I mean, how long have you been making the 12-mile ride and then talking yourself out of it before you got to the door?" She said it evenly, without accusation. She had been aware the past 3 weeks of something she couldn't quite prove, a particular sense, twice of a horse on the road, that slowed and then didn't stop. Frances had mentioned once carefully that she thought someone had ridden past the property 2 Saturdays back. He was quiet for a long moment. 3 times, he said. Why did you stop? Because I wasn't ready, he said. Because I was still trying to come up with the right thing to say, and I'd get halfway here and realize I was still thinking about what I wanted from the conversation, instead of what the conversation needed from me. He looked at the table. Today I stopped thinking about that. What changed? He looked up. Samuel, he said, which was not what she expected. Samuel. He came to me last week, Nathaniel said. Asked if he could speak plainly. I said yes. He said. He stopped. A small, rueful expression crossed his face. He said he had driven you out of that house at 3 in the morning and had thought about it every day since, and he wanted to know whether I intended to fix it, or whether he should start looking for a position where a man's conscience wasn't required to go along with the employment. Clara stared at him. Samuel said that to you. He did, word for word. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to it, and close to something else. Something that looked like the specific emotion of a man, understanding belatedly what kind of people had been in his household and whether he had deserved them. I didn't know how to answer him, and when I couldn't answer him, I realized I'd been letting that question sit unanswered for 3 weeks to myself too, and it was time to stop. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about Samuel on the drive to Crozet, the careful neutrality of his face, the way he had not asked a single question he didn't need to ask. She had thought of him several times in the weeks since. She had wondered whether he knew what his silence that night had cost him in terms of loyalty to an employer who had not earned it. He's a good man, she said. Better than I gave him credit for, Nathaniel said. Better than I gave a lot of people credit for. She heard what was underneath that. She wasn't going to make him say it more explicitly. He had said enough explicit things in enough difficult rooms lately. She understood that this one was meant to include her. What is it you want to say today? She asked. Not the things you've already said. What's left? He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. I want to ask you what you need from me. Not what you're willing to accept. Not what you'd take as proof that I've changed. What you actually need, day to day, going forward. He held her gaze. Because I've been thinking about what went wrong between us, and a great deal of it was me making assumptions about what you needed instead of asking. And I don't want to keep doing that, even now, even in the... He paused. In the trying. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You want the honest answer, or the careful one? The honest one, he said immediately. I've had enough careful. She nodded. I need to be asked, she said. That's the simplest thing and also the biggest one. I need the questions you never asked. What do you think about this? What do you want for your life? What are you hoping for? What are you afraid of? I need them asked, and I need you to actually wait for the answers, not the polite answers, the real ones. She held his gaze. I also need to keep what I've built here. Not this house. I understand I'll leave this house eventually. But what I've built inside myself these past weeks. The teaching, the work, the being useful in ways that are mine, not borrowed from your name or your household. I wouldn't take that from you, he said. You wouldn't mean to, she said. But a house has gravity. A marriage has gravity. Things get absorbed into it without anyone deciding that's what should happen. I watched it happen to me before. I won't let it happen again. She paused. If we, whatever we become, I need to remain a person who does things. Real things. Not arranged things. Not things that exist to support the picture of a good household. Things that matter to me. He listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't immediately respond, which was new. The old Nathaniel would have filled the space at the end of her sentences with his own thoughts before she had fully finished having hers. He sat with what she had said. Then he said, Polly. She blinked. What about her? The girl you've been teaching. I heard about her from Frances. He said this simply without defensiveness. I want you to know that if you come back, if you ever choose to, there is a schoolroom in the east wing of that house that has been unused for 15 years, and there is no reason on earth it couldn't be used for whatever you decided it should be used for. Children from the county people who work the land, whoever you thought needed it." He paused. "I'm not saying that as a bargaining point. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you should know the whole picture when you're making decisions." Clara sat very still. A schoolroom, 15 years unused. She had not known it existed. She had walked that house for 2 years and 4 months and had not known. She made herself breathe steadily. She was not going to make a decision based on a room, however much the thought of it lit something in her chest. She was not going to be moved by the gesture rather than the man. "You said you wanted to court me again," she said. "The last time you were here at Crozet." "I remember. I said I'd see you, on my terms, without pressure." "You did, and I have tried to honor that." "You have," she said. "Mostly." The 3 times he'd turned back counted as trying, she supposed. They also counted as evidence of something of a man attempting to be thoughtful about the pace he was moving at, rather than simply moving at his own. "I want to add a condition." "Name it," he said. "I want you to come here 3 more times," she said. 3 more visits, no agenda, no asking for answers, just coming and talking the way 2 people who are trying to know each other should talk. What you think about, what you remember, what you regret that isn't me, what you hope for. She watched his face. "And I'll do the same. No performance, no careful versions. And after those 3 visits, I'll tell you what I've decided." He looked at her. 3 visits, he said. 3 visits. He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. "When's the first?" "You're already here," she said. "This counts." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one that it changed the quality of the room. "Then I'll make it worth counting," he said. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked, genuinely talked the way she had told him they should, without agenda and without performance. He told her about his father, which she had never known much about, and she understood within 10 minutes that a good deal of what she had experienced in Nathaniel's coldness was the direct inheritance of a man who had raised his son to believe that emotion was a liability. He talked about it without excusing himself. He laid it out like a map of territory he'd been living in without knowing its name. She told him about Baltimore, about her father's study, where she had read everything she could get her hands on, and about the way she had arrived in Virginia as a new wife full of opinions and observations, and had within the first 3 months understood that those opinions were not going to be welcome in the way she had imagined. She told him this without anger. It was a fact. It had happened. She was telling it to him the way she had wanted to tell it for 2 years, just plainly, just because it was true. He listened. He asked one question carefully at the right moment. What had she been reading in her father's study? She told him. It took 10 minutes to answer properly. He listened to all 10 minutes. When he left, he tipped his hat to Francis with the specific courtesy of a man who knows he is being assessed and who has decided to make no attempt to manage the assessment. Francis watched him ride out, then came back inside and set the kettle on. "Well," Clara said. "He listened," Francis said. "For 2 hours he listened more than he talked." She let that sit. "In my experience, that's harder for men like him than most of what they'd call hard." Clara wrapped her hands around the tea that Francis set in front of her. The shawl was still on the table. She had not moved it since he placed it there. She looked at it now and thought about the hook behind the wardrobe door and the morning she had left it and everything that had moved between that morning and this afternoon. She picked it up and folded it carefully and set it on the chair beside her. Not put away. Not displayed. Just set down within reach in the place where a thing belongs when you've decided it belongs to you again. The second visit was on a Saturday 12 days later. He brought nothing this time. Just himself on his horse and plain clothes hat in his hands when Francis opened the door. He came in, and they sat on the porch because the morning was cool in the way that late August in Virginia occasionally surprised you with, as though the summer was remembering briefly that it would not last forever, and the conversation went somewhere neither of them had quite planned. He asked her about the schoolroom. Not with the intent she'd been braced for, not angling back towards the offer he'd made, not using it as leverage. He asked because he had apparently gone into the East Wing the week after his visit, and actually looked at it, and he described what he'd found with the slightly abashed specificity of a man who has discovered something he should have known about sooner. "The shelves are empty," he said. "The windows work, the floors sound. There's a desk that would need replacing, and 6 chairs that wouldn't." He paused. "I found 2 primers on the bottom shelf. They were my mother's." Clara looked at him. "Your mother taught—" "She did, before she married my father." He said this with a careful flatness that told her more than the words did. "I didn't know the room was hers until I found the primers. Her name was in the front cover." Clara felt something move in her chest. "What was her name?" "Anne," he said. "Anne Whitfield before she was Ashford." He looked out at the yard. "She died when I was 9. I don't have much of her. Mostly I have what people said about her, which wasn't much because my father didn't encourage the subject." He was quiet for a moment. Finding the primers I don't know what it felt like. Like finding a room that had been locked and realizing the key had been there the whole time. Clara said nothing for a while. She let the morning be quiet around what he had said. Then she said she would have liked Polly. He looked at her. Something in his face opened in a way she didn't have a word for. "Yes," he said. "I reckon she would have." They talked for 3 hours. When he left that day, Frances didn't say anything at all. She just looked at Clara with the steady, observant expression of a woman watching something become true in real time. Clara went for a long walk that afternoon. She needed the movement and the thinking that movement made possible. She walked the edge of the property in the cooling afternoon, and she thought about primers with a woman's name inside the cover, and about a 9-year-old boy growing up in a house where grief was not encouraged and emotion was a liability, and the room where his mother had taught sat locked and unused for 25 years. She thought about the man she had married, and the man she had watched become slowly, and at some cost, something that contained the possibility of the person he might have been if someone had unlocked that room sooner. She was not making excuses for him. She was never going to make excuses for what he had done. But she was also not going to mistake understanding for excuse. You could hold both. You could understand a thing and still require it never happen again. She walked back to the house in the early evening and told Frances she thought the second visit had gone well. Frances said, "One more." "One more," Clara agreed. The third visit came on a Wednesday morning in September, and she knew before he arrived that this one would be different. She knew it the way she had known things lately, with the clear, settled certainty of a woman who has spent enough time with herself to trust her own reading of the world. He came to the door, and she saw his face, and she knew. Not because he was performing anything, because he wasn't. He stood at the door with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who has come to the end of something not in defeat, but in arrival. A man who has walked a distance and is now standing at the place he was walking toward and is not entirely sure what to do with that. "Come in," she said. "I'd rather—" He paused. "Could we walk if that suits?" They walked the edge of the property. The September morning was different from August. The light had changed thinner and cleaner, the first real suggestion that the summer was giving way. The apple tree at the front of the yard had fruit on it now, the small hard apples of September still mostly green. Howe was quiet for the first part of the walk. She let him be. She had learned in 3 visits, and in the long process of learning him more honestly than she had in 2 years of marriage, that his quiets were different from each other in the same way her own were. This one was not avoidance. It was preparation. When he finally spoke, he said, "I want to tell you something that I've been trying to find the right way to say for about 3 weeks." "Say it without finding the right way," she said. "That tends to be more accurate." He looked at her. Then he said, "I was in my study last month trying to write to you, and I couldn't figure out what to put down. And I went to the window the way I do when I'm stuck on something, and I was looking out at the north field, and I realized—" He stopped, tried again. "I realized I was looking at everything I owned and wondering whether it meant anything. Not in the way a man wonders when he's having a bad day. In a real way. Whether any of it, the land, the house, the position, whether any of it was worth what I had done to maintain it. The kind of man it had required me to be." She listened. She did not fill the space. "And then I thought about you," he said. "Not about having you back. Not about the marriage or the county or any of it. I thought about you specifically, about the way you walked out of Caldwell Hall. About the letter you wrote me. About how you packed only what was yours. And I thought that is what it looks like when a person knows who they are. He paused. I have spent my whole life in rooms full of people, and I have very rarely known who I am. And I looked at you even in the worst moment of what I had done to you, and you knew. Clara felt something move in her throat. She held it steady. I want to know who I am, he said. Not the Nathaniel Ashford who inherited land and managed a position and said the wrong thing in front of 200 people. The actual person underneath that. And I think... He stopped. I think you might be the only person I've ever met who would tell me the truth about it. She walked for a moment in silence. Then she said, I'm not a mirror, Nathaniel. I'm not here to reflect you back to yourself. If you come back to me, you come back to me a separate person with her own life and her own work and her own mind that does not exist in service to yours. I know that, he said. That's not, I didn't mean it that way. I know you didn't, she said. I'm saying it so we're clear. We're clear, he said. And then quieter. Are you going to tell me what you've decided? She looked at the apple tree as they passed it. She looked at the house where she had spent 6 weeks becoming again the fullest version of herself. She looked at the road that went east 12 miles to a house she had left at 3 in the morning with 2 trunks and a letter in 7 sentences. She thought about Anne Whitfield's primers on the shelf in the east wing. She thought about Polly's face when she got a word right. She thought about the hook behind the wardrobe door and the shawl that was now folded on the chair in her room at Francis's house within reach belonging to her. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned to face him. Here are my terms, she said. Not conditions for a trial. Terms for a real thing. You take them or you don't, and if you don't, we part as people who tried honestly, and there's no bitterness in it. She held his gaze. The East Wing schoolroom opens. I run it. Whatever I decide it should be, whoever I decide it should serve, that is entirely mine to determine. You don't advise it, you don't manage it, you don't have opinions about it unless I ask you for them. Agreed, he said. I keep Margaret, she said. She comes back with me. Her position is hers for as long as she wants it. She never lost it, he said. I've been keeping her wages current since the day she left. Clara looked at him. You've been paying Margaret's wages. She left because of me, he said simply. It seemed like the least that was owed. She stared at him for a long moment. That was not something she had known. She added it quietly to the accounting she had been keeping. I speak, she said. When I have something to say, I say it. I don't package it or time it or manage it for your comfort. If something is wrong, I say so directly, and I expect to be heard. I want you to say so, he said. I am asking you to say so. And if I say so, and you dismiss it, then you tell me you've said so and been dismissed, and we have that conversation too, he said. I'm not asking for a marriage where everything is smooth. I'm asking for one where the difficult things get said. He looked at her. I've learned what the alternative costs. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said the last thing. I choose this, she said. Not because it's expected. Not because it's easier than the alternative. Not because I'm afraid of anything or obligated to anyone. If I come back because I have looked at you honestly over the past weeks, and I have seen something that is worth the choosing. She held his gaze with complete steadiness. Can you accept those terms, all of them without amendment? He looked at her. Yes, he said. Just that. Just the one word, plain and unadorned, and without the social confidence she had spent 2 years watching him perform. Just a man saying yes and meaning it with everything he had. She nodded once. Then here is what we'll do, she said. I'll come back to the house at the end of the month. Not this week, not next week. At the end of the month, which gives us both time to understand that what was just decided was decided clearly and not in the heat of a moment. She let him hear all of it. And when I come back as Clara Whitmore Ashford. Both names, not one swallowed by the other. Both names, he said. Both names, she confirmed. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, at least not directed at her, not with this quality of directness. It was not the performance of a man in love. It was the face of someone who has been standing in a difficult place for a long time and has just found something solid to stand on. He said, "Clara Whitmore Ashford." He said it the way you say the name of something you intend to respect. She turned back toward the house. He walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Beside. Equal in step, equal in pace. Frances was at the kitchen table when they came in doing absolutely nothing at all, which was so unlike her that it was its own form of comment. She looked at the two of them and read them with the accuracy of a woman who has been watching people for 60 years and knows what decided looks like on a face. She stood up and poured 3 cups of tea without being asked. Nathaniel sat down at the kitchen table where Clara had read his letters. He sat down in the house where she had rebuilt herself. He sat with his hat on the table in front of him and accepted the tea. Frances handed him with a quiet thank you that she received with the neutral dignity of a woman reserving full judgment but not withholding ordinary courtesy. Clara sat across from him. The September morning moved around them. 3 cups of tea on a table that had seen a great deal of honest work and difficult thinking and patient rebuilding, all of it hers, all of it kept. Outside, Polly was coming up the road with her primer, her serious face already prepared for the day's lesson, already expecting to be met with the particular quality of attention that Clara provided, which was different from other attention she had received in her short life, which actually waited for her, which actually wanted to know what she thought. Clara heard her coming and stood. "I have a lesson," she said to Nathaniel. He stood when she stood. "I'll go," he said. "You don't have to," she said. And then she said the thing that she had not planned to say, the thing that came from the part of her that was already building the actual shape of what came next, not the negotiated version, the real one. "You could stay if you wanted. You could see what it looks like." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was new and specific and exactly what it appeared to be. "I'd like that," he said. Polly came in with the primer. She looked at Nathaniel with the frank assessing gaze of a 12-year-old who has decided she will not be intimidated by people simply because they are older or richer. She looked at Clara. She looked back at Nathaniel. "Are you watching the lesson?" she asked him. "If that's all right with you," he said. Polly considered this for approximately 1 second. "You can watch," she said. "But don't interrupt. Ma'am doesn't like interruptions during the lesson." Nathaniel looked at Clara over Polly's head. Clara said nothing. But something in her face said, "She's right, and she's also the best thing I've built here, and now you know it." He sat in the chair by the wall. He folded his hands. He did not interrupt. Polly read clear and steady 3 pages further than she had been the week before. She made one mistake and corrected it herself before Clara had to say anything. She finished the passage and looked up with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done a thing well and knows it. "Good," Clara said. "Very good." Polly looked pleased in the contained way she had, not performing delight, just receiving it. She looked at Nathaniel, who had been watching the whole thing. "Did you see?" she said. "I saw," he said. "That was well done." Polly nodded, as though this confirmed what she had already decided was the case. Then she turned back to Clara for the next assignment. Clara gave it to her. Then she looked across the room at the man sitting in the chair by the wall who was watching a girl learn to read in his wife's aunt's kitchen, and who had the expression on his face of someone encountering something important for the first time. He caught her eye. He did not look away. She did not look away either. This was the beginning of the actual thing. Not the courtship, and not the negotiation, and not the public correcting of public records. This quiet room this morning lesson, this ordinary Tuesday in September, with 3 people at different stages of understanding what it meant to be seen clearly and not flinch. This was where it started. In the weeks that followed, the county would see Nathaniel Ashford arrive at a small house near Crozet on a regular schedule. They would note that he came alone and stayed for reasonable hours, and left with the manner of a man who has been somewhere that mattered. They would observe eventually that Clara Whitmore appeared in Albemarle County again at the market at church at Eleanor Caldwell's autumn gathering, where she arrived with her chin level and her back straight, and accepted the welcome she was given with the grace of someone who has earned the right to accept things fully. They would observe that she wore the cashmere shawl on the first cool day of October. They would observe that she wore it with the ease of something that belonged to her completely. They would observe in November that she returned to the Ashford house. Not as a woman who had been let back in, but as a woman who had decided to walk back through her own door. The East Wing schoolroom opened in December. 6 children the first week, 12 the second. Polly Briggs from Crozet, who had gotten all the way through her primer and started on the second one, rode the 12 miles on her father's mule because she had decided that this was where her education was happening and distance was not an argument she was willing to entertain. Samuel, who had kept his position and his conscience in the same employment without having to choose between them, drove Clara to town on Thursdays without being asked because he had learned her schedule and because he was, as she had always known, a good man. Margaret came back. She organized the linen cupboard according to her own system, which she did not explain to anyone. Mrs. Holt, who had spent 3 months running a household that was slowly revealing all the invisible work it had previously contained, greeted Clara's return with an expression that was equal parts relief and profound vindication. And Nathaniel Ashford, who had once stood in a ballroom and chosen the worst version of himself in front of everyone who mattered, stood in the East Wing schoolroom on a cold December morning and watched his wife teach a room full of children how to read and understood that he was looking at the most important thing that had ever happened in this house. He did not say this to her. Not that morning. He said it later on an evening in January when they were sitting by the fire in the parlor, a thing they had started doing, just sitting. No agenda, the conversation finding its own shape, and she had looked up from the book she was reading and caught him watching her and asked what he was thinking. He told her. All of it. The morning in the schoolroom. What he had understood. What it had taken him to get there, and what it had cost, and why it had been worth every cent of that cost, which was considerable, and which he would pay again. She listened. When he was done, she set her book in her lap and looked at him with the direct, clear gaze that he had once found uncomfortable and now found to be the most honest thing in any room he stood in. "I know," she said. "You know. I've been watching you learn it," she said. "For months. I've been watching you and taking account and deciding whether it was real." She paused. "It's real." He looked at her. And, she said with the particular quality of a woman who has found the ground she was looking for and is standing on it with both feet. "I chose this, freely, clearly, without reservation." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that." Howe was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved. The January night was cold outside, and the house was warm. And the house was warm because 2 people in it had decided slowly and with considerable difficulty and at great cost to the versions of themselves that hadn't been working to build something true. "I know it," he said, "and I won't forget it." She picked her book back up. He did not stop watching her. Outside the county slept under a January sky full of stars. The same stars she had watched through this carriage window. The night she left the same sky that had pressed down close and bright over the Virginia fields, while she rode west with her 2 trunks and her letter in 7 sentences, and the particular solid feeling of a woman who has made the only honest choice available to her. She had made another honest choice since. This one had cost more. This one was also worth more. And Clara Whitmore Ashford, who had walked out of a ballroom with her head level and her back straight and her whole self intact, sat in her own parlor in the warmth of her own choosing and turned the page.